Story 1. A fairly avid camper hiker. Couple that comes to mind. 1. Went on a 5-day gold panning trip with a couple of buddies of mine. We drove 6 hours down unused logging roads. We're talking overgrown roads with trees having to be removed from the road to pass. We saw not one human the entire time we were out there, except for on the third night at 3 a.m. We are sitting around the fire, drinking some beers, swatting at bugs, and shooting the shit when I hear something. I look over and notice some light in the trees. What the? It's a truck driving up the logging road we had cleared ourselves to get there at 3 a.m. The truck gets up to where we are, pulls into where we made camp, a small turnoff spot for logging trucks, and sits there for 10 seconds while we all kind of stare in shock at one another. I get up and start walking towards the truck to say hello and ask what the heck they are doing out at 3 a.m. on abandoned logging roads, when the truck just backs up, turns around, and drives off the way it came. The guys just drove 6 hours down logging roads all through the night, sees us and leaves without saying a word. We are all sitting there going, oh, what the fuck? We all figured this guy was driving down the road, getting out, and coming back to kill us in our sleep. The next morning we head down the road and nothing. They didn't set up camp or anything. Just left. We figured we were likely camped out near a grow-op for one of the gangs. Hell's Angels, most likely. And they were coming out to check who had come out to their spot, or they were there to pick the crop in the middle of the night. 2. One time driving down a bunch of logging roads at night, 4 a.m., looking for a campsite we had driven past. We took a wrong turn and drove right into a drug operation, cashing out the crop. We turn a corner and blam floodlights and like 15 guys all staring at us in the middle of the forest down logging roads. We just sort of turned around and got the fuck out of there. This is a lot like the first story, except I'm the creep in the truck. 3. One time I was out hiking in the backwoods with a buddy of mine. Way out there with nobody in sight. In the evening, I start to gather some wood for the campfire that evening, and I pull this stick out of the trees. Stick is maybe 5 feet long and 3 inches wide. It looks like a nice walking stick, straight and mostly smooth. Then I notice that one end of the stick is smooth, like it's been whittled by someone. I'm thinking, oh wow, what are the odds of that? It is a walking stick. Someone has carved a smooth handle on one end. Nope, it's not a handle, it's a dick. Someone had carved the end of this stick into a dick. Someone was fucking the forest. Literally. This wasn't some crude carving, just FYI. This was work, like the person put hours into carving it and was very good at carving. This was a 6 inches dong carved with love and feeling, right down to its having bulging veins and other fine details. What the fuck? So I took the dick stick back to camp and threatened to poke my buddy with it, yelling that the forest was going to give him tree aids. Story 2. I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Stringer in NC. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere and someone was hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came upon. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. Story 3. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. Think mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in, and we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, and we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in, and the waves on the lake swelled to 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky canoes. We pull off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp and rush to avoid being thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set up camp and hunker down for the night. By the next morning, it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp, looking for a good fishing spot. What we found was another campsite. However, it was wrecked. Trash was strewn around everywhere. The tent collapsed and torn, and clothes were on the ground. At first, we were just disgusted, like what assholes did this, or left their shit out to be bear food. The more we looked around though, the weirder things seemed though. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes was still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, like a serious set of hiking equipment. Enough for 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. The other half was untouched but thrown on the ground. Like somebody noped the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple of hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. My first thought was a bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, but nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being destroyed and half being untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. Story 4. I and a buddy chose some national forests in Oregon, specifically for how remote it was. About a year prior, a family became lost and the father was never found, although the mother and child lived to tell the tale. Anyway, we set up camp around 4 p.m. after getting pretty deep into the woods on a mountain accessed by logging roads, maybe about 200 yards from where we parked near a lake. Without much else to do, we started a fire and cracked some beers as the sun went down. Then pickup trucks started going through the woods, slowing down when they saw our campfire. We got curious and stupid via the beers and went deeper into the woods. Seemed like a hell-uva party was going on. Then we stumbled into a clearing where maybe 15-20 dudes were hanging around a bonfire next to a mossy rundown camper trailer. One had a pistol on his hip, another was just chilling with a shotgun. We're like, oh shit at first, but someone approaches us and acts neighborly and invites us to have a beer, so it seemed okay. They were joking around mostly, some talking about drugs, coke, meth, but some older dudes seemed pretty tense. As this happened, 4 or 5 dudes who seemed to be standing sentry at the camper, which didn't look like it had been moved in a long time, went inside for a few minutes. When they came back out, they said we were faggots and saw us making out. Pretty quickly, I got up to head back to our site, but my slower, drunker buddy took a few punches. Then he made it out and started following, and we were sprinting through the forest in the darkness, just hoping to get back to our site by spotting the glowing embers of our burnt-out fire, the whole time with gun toters in tow. We found our site, and with pretty much everything in the tent, we pulled the stakes to toss them in the trunk of our car when we hear an enraged scream only about 50 yards from us, "Kill the faggots!" So we were like, fuck it, dropped the tent and gear without even saying a word to each other, and sprinted in the direction of the car. We peeled out and thought we were good, But about 30 seconds later, some headlights come up from behind us, and I'm like, fuck, that's the truck that shotgun dude was chilling at. So now we're being pursued by crazy gun-toting rednecks with a superior vehicle in the unfamiliar forest on unmaintained logging roads in the dark. And the only thing we can do is speed up. I remember looking at the speedometer as we approached a washed-out hairpin turn, and it was moving from 45 to 50 miles per hour, and the truck was tailing us pretty close, like by only a couple of feet. And I was pretty sure that we were going to slide off the cliff and die. Somehow my drunk-ass buddy managed to power slide that turns and get some distance between us and the tweakers, and we eventually made it to a paved two-lane, at which point the truck pulled off. We put it together later that the camper was a meth lab. Nothing else it really could have been, deep in the forest with armed guards and shit. But yeah, it resulted in a drunken high-speed night chase on unfamiliar logging roads, and we nearly slid off the side of a mountain. Story 5. I was camping and hiking in the Okefenokee Swamp. We, my girlfriend and me, were far from being the only ones there. But when we woke up one morning, we took a canoe out in the swamp to explore. It was early. There was a thick layer of fog resting just atop the water. The whole swamp was completely still. No animals in sight at all. We paddled down the waterway for a while and saw nothing else. Not a single person. Not a bird. Not anything. We didn't hear a single sound. We had just cornered a bend in the swamp and we hear it. The loudest guttural bellow I had ever heard in my life. I could feel it echo through my chest, a true dinosaur sound. We stopped paddling and looked at each other a little creeped out. We knew it was an alligator, but we had never heard one that loud. We both looked behind the canoe, and behind us, the backs and eyes of at least 20 alligators had risen. They had just surfaced out of nowhere. We slowly start to paddle forward and we hear more bellows. They came from all around us. In front, behind, to the sides, sounds emanating from the bush-covered banks. With each glance behind us, we saw more eyes appear. More scaled mounds break the water's surface. From the banks in front, we would catch tails sliding into the water. Ripples of these huge reptiles broke the water all around us. We looked back again as we paddled faster. Easily 40 alligators behind us now, and we began to see them appear in front. 10, 15 huge lizards seemingly blocking our path. Then one of the largest alligators I have ever seen surfaced right where my paddle was going down. I hit the beast on the back of the head, and the thrash he made was incredible. When his massive head hit the side of the small canoe, I thought we were going in the water. Water came into the canoe as the side dipped down. The beast disappeared below the boat, and we held steady. We paddled forward as fast as we could, right into the dotted landscape of scales and eyes. Behind us, that same guttural roar echoed through my body. As we cut through the field of eyes and backs, we started to see the path clear. The huge monster that had almost capsized us bellowed one last time. We turned as we made it past the last of the animals, and we could see the monster staring at us, watching us leave. All the other alligators began to sink to the water's floor. The big guy stayed there watching until he was satisfied we had gone, I guess. Then he disappeared without a sound, back into the black, murky depths of the swamp. We banked the canoe further up the waterway, got out, and just sat around for a while taking in what had just happened. Story 6. A few years ago, I was hiking somewhere on the border of Montana and Idaho. The exact location escapes me at the moment. I was with my uncle, and the hike was something like 6 miles in, 6 miles out from TH to a lake. Keep in mind that this is a very remote area. To even get to the TH was about a 20-30 mile drive in on dirt logging roads. There were no other cars at the TH, and we didn't see anyone on the trail the entire day. On the hike in, we noticed a makeshift camp set up along the trail to our right. This was by no means a designated camping area. It just happened to be enough of a clearing to pitch a tent and have a small area to walk around in. The camp looked somewhat disheveled, and there was nobody in immediate sight. We continued to the lake, ate lunch, and headed home sometime later in the afternoon. On our way back, the camp was now to our left. Now that we were headed in the opposite direction, the camp came into view much sooner along the trail than it did on our hike in. It was a few minutes until we reached this camp. I had a very eerie feeling now. From this direction, I could now see that the tent flap was unzipped entirely. I found this strange and scanned the camp for its residents. By the time we reached the camp, nobody had appeared, and I decided to yell out to anyone who may be in the camp. Maybe to say hello, maybe to see if anyone needed any help. I just had a strange feeling that something was wrong here. At this point, my uncle was very much freaked out and was trying to continue walking along without incident. I yelled out 3 or 4 times towards the camp, each time walking closer and closer to the tent. I got no response. I stood a few feet away from the tent and scanned around the hills, and there was nobody in sight. The camp looked the same as it did on our hike. Upon further inspection, I could see a few items strewn about the grounds beyond the tent. But my first stop was going to be the tent. I thought for a few seconds and pondered exactly what I may find in the tent. I was scared of waking someone, but more scared of finding someone who may not be able to wake up. I crept closer, my uncle reluctantly following about 10 paces behind. I yelled a few more times, no answer. I push aside the flap, and there's nothing but a sleeping bag, laid out perfectly as if someone had just unrolled it. Keep in mind, this is a very nice tent. Perfectly assembled too. Nice vestibule, spacious and sturdy. It struck me as odd that someone with such a nice tent would have been so foolish to have left their tent unzipped. So I stood and scanned again. This tent was a few hundred feet away from a very small water source. There were various items, as I said earlier, every 50 feet or so. I noticed a Ziploc bag on the top of a boulder, right next to this stream. I headed over there and found that it contained several strips of uncooked bacon. Again, strange. My thoughts were racing, and I had an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I put the bacon back where I found it and looked around again. Nobody was here. We hadn't seen anyone all day, and this camp looked the same as it did in the morning. Who in their right mind would leave this bag of bacon sitting right here? Who would even bring bacon into a place like this? And how? There was no ice chest, not even a car at the TH. Why would you bring food like that into an area where there are mountain lions as well as bears? There wasn't even a stove or any cooking utensils in sight. This was a very barren camp. My thoughts began to slow down, and I looked to my feet. I saw several shell casings and several rounds to a .45 caliber handgun. This was the icing on the WTF cake. My uncle insisted we leave immediately, and at this point I agreed. We hiked rather quickly out. Counting paces, I calculated that the makeshift camp was about 1 mile from the TH. I still have no idea what could have happened at that camp. Still freaks me out. But it makes for a very good story. Story 7. I was on a long road trip with a friend about 2 years ago when we stopped in an incredibly remote area. It was a huge forested area on the coast with a military base tucked away somewhere in there. My friend and I decided to go for a hike at about 9 p.m. It might seem like a stupid idea, but the area wasn't exactly mountainous. It was a pretty bright night, and we were well geared, so if we got lost, we could have easily waited out the night. We sort of forgot that it was Halloween until we were halfway through the hike, talking about how big the moon was. A 20-minute walk away from the empty car park, and approximately 20-30 minutes drive to civilization. As we walked, we could hear thumping, but we disregarded it as kangaroos. It was scary at first to hear something that big go racing past in a dark blue, but it happened so often we got used to it eventually. When we neared the coast, we could hear the waves rolling in. We searched around for a way down to the beach when suddenly we heard something different. There was a steep descent on one side of the path, and we could hear something big climbing up it from the water. Branches were snapping, and you could hear heavy breaths as it got further and further up. My friend turned to leave when we heard a man's voice say, shakily, "Hello?" My friend looked at me and shook his head and backed away silently. I'm instinctively curious. "Hello?" I called back. "Is that the path?" Holy shit, somebody had fallen off the path on the way to the beach. "Yeah, we'll pull you up." Using a broken branch, we pulled him up to the path. He stood up, thanked us, and said, "Have you seen my friend?" No. "I'm sure he'll be around. Thanks, guys." And with that, he walked off. We went to the beach, skipped some stones, and on the way back, we saw him again standing on the path with another man. They were just standing there, talking quietly. We passed, said good day, received a mumbled reply, and walked on by. When we got to our car, there was a Ford WD parked not far away. There's no way we could have missed that. It was right in front of our headlights. Where did he come from? And how did we pass his friend? How did they get split up? Who fucking knows? Story 8. This happened back in the mid-'80s. My friends and I, 4 in all, used to go hiking in the Cascades in Oregon quite a bit. While 99% of the hikers stick to the trails, we'd plan trips off the beaten path to discover areas few people had ever seen. We'd plan a trip, take a trail up to the general area, and then strike out towards a place we wanted to check out, sometimes a day or two out, depending on how rough the terrain was. Our last trip started normally enough. We'd made it to our launch point, spent the night, had breakfast the following day, and had broken out our Forest Service topographical maps to make our plans. This time around, we hadn't decided on a destination and were considering our options. That's the last thing we remember for nearly 24 hours. We woke up the next day, still in our clothes from the previous day, in our tents. We didn't even know a day had passed until one of my friends checked his watch and noticed that the date wasn't right, which I confirmed with my watch. Yes, even back then, some watches kept the date. One moment we were looking over maps to see where we wanted to go. The next we woke up in our tents, all of us feeling like we were hungover. The thing is, while my friends swore they didn't remember anything, I did, if only a little. What I remember is that we were doing some hard hiking in the mountains when we heard children's voices, the sort of noise you hear at a playground. All of us were what the fucking, thinking that we'd screwed up our navigational skills in a way that boggled the mind, and we headed towards the noise to see just how the hell we'd gotten so far off track. And we're on God's green earth, we were. We broke out of the tree line into a clear area where there were several low, squat buildings, the sort that reminds you of what the U.S. Army builds: spare, utilitarian, ugly, green. Surrounding the buildings, I assume all the way around, but I don't know, was a heavy-duty chain-link fence, not the normal sort, but the industrial strength kind. Towards where we were was a large blacktop, where children were running around, and a mixed group of kids and adults were also playing a game of basketball. It was indeed a playground of sorts, inside of what looked like a military compound, out in the middle of fucking nowhere, deep in the mountains, and not on any map. I remember one of the adults looking up, then everything gradually falling silent as the entire group of adults and kids eventually noticed the 4 dumbstruck hikers on the other side of the fence, and then nothing. That's it until I woke up in one of our 2 tents the next day. As I said, my friends said they remembered nothing, and all they wanted to do after they realized they lost a day was get the fuck out of the mountains and back home. Me, I remembered, at least a little, and I was pissed because I figured we had stumbled onto something secret and had been drugged and dumped back at our campsite for our efforts. I wanted to figure out where the hell we'd been hiking, go back and see what there was to see, but the guys were having none of it. I tried several times to see if I could get any of the gang to go back up with me, this time with cameras, and try to figure out where we'd decided to hike, but the guys flat out refused any discussion of the matter, much less an actual attempt. Going by yourself into the wild country is outright stupid, and I wasn't quite so pissed as to consider this a valid option. So I never went on my own. To this day, I have no idea what it is that we found, or why someone thought it necessary to drug us and dump us. I figured we weren't killed outright because 4 missing, experienced hikers would result in a newsworthy search and rescue op, especially since one of us was sort of famous and just might make national news if they up and disappeared. I'm still pissed about it though, and would seriously like to dish out some payback to the shitstains who fucked with us.